For this video, I had the pleasure of talking to Dr. Andreas Eenfeldt. Andreas is a medical doctor from Stockholm, Sweden, and the founder of dietdoctor.com, the world's largest website for low-carb eating, and more recently of the Hava app. As you will see, Andreas is very knowledgeable in the areas of nutrition and body weight regulation, and specifically different weight loss approaches. In this conversation, we speak in detail about how to change the quality of the foods we eat to feel happy and full while eating fewer calories. At the end of this video, you will understand which specific steps you can take to make your diet more satiating per calorie to prevent weight gain or to lose weight. Andreas, thanks so much for taking the time.
Thank you for having me, Mario. Big fan of your work.
So I thought we'd jump into this conversation by looking at a few foods, let's say pretzels, crackers, potato chips, cookies, ice cream. These are all foods that I think is common knowledge that if we have a lot of those in our diet, we tend to overeat calories, we tend to gain weight. And if I'd asked you 10 years ago, why do people overeat on these foods? What would your response probably have been?
I would have said that's because they're full of sugar and carbohydrates. And people get obese by eating too many carbs because that raises the blood glucose and that raises the insulin, which is a fat-storing hormone. And then you get to fat storage. Today, I don't quite believe it's that simple anymore.
So what would you currently say? Like just taking these foods as an example, like what are some of the other factors that contribute overeating when people consume these foods?
So I think that the main factor is that these foods are all very, very low in satiety per calorie, meaning you don't get full by eating them until you've eaten a lot. So these are foods that trick the brain into wanting to eat far too much. And there are various reasons why that is the case. Starts with protein. These foods are all very low in protein. Perhaps they have a protein level at about 10% or something, which is actually where people tend to eat the most. Then they are low in fiber. Then they are all high in energy density, especially these dried goods, baked goods. And they're also quite addictive. Different terms for this, hyperpalatable or hedonic, these combinations of sugar and fat together, like in ice cream, or concentrated carbohydrates and salt together, like in salted pretzels, that tend to drive us to eat more than we need. Like, you may not be hungry after a big dinner, but you can find place for some ice cream or a cookie because it has that addictive quality. So multiple factors, but I would say the summary is these foods have a low satiety per calorie, meaning that you have to eat a lot to be satisfied.
Why do diet quality and satiety per calorie matter? And so that's an interesting concept in and of itself. And before we get to, the next step you took and where you took it, maybe let's stop here for a second and ask, like, low satiety per calorie, what does that even mean? Like, isn't it the case that you or I, we have a certain body size, we have a total energy expenditure? Doesn't that determine how many calories we eat? Isn't it the case that, for you, it's always, 2,800 or 3,000 kilocalories a day? Why are you even suggesting that the types of food we're eating are having an impact on how many calories we choose to eat?
Well, first of all, because we know that's true. There are now a number of studies that have proven without a doubt that people eat far, far more calories of certain foods compared to other foods. For example, in general, ultra-processed foods tend to cause people to eat way more for multiple reasons. And this has been tested. This is well demonstrated that at least over the first few weeks, people eat between 500 and 1,000 more calories per day when you go from mostly unprocessed foods to mostly ultra-processed foods. So we know this is true. These foods make people unconsciously eat much, much more. Like if you tell people to eat as much or as little as they want, they will spontaneously, without even thinking about it, eat far more of these ultra-processed foods.
Mm-hmm. Hava, an app to help users maximize satiety per calorie. you're so convinced about the satiety per calorie concept that you're not just coming on podcasts to talk about this concept. You've taken it a step further and actually created an app to help people eat in a way that takes advantage of this concept. Can you talk a little bit about the Hava app?
Yeah, absolutely. Because I feel like this is such a revolutionary concept. And I mean, people have been talking about it. Some scientists have been talking about it for a number of years, certainly in the context of ultra-processed foods. But nobody's built a product for it. And why do you need a product for it? Well, because this is very complicated to do in your head or in my head, even if you're a geek like me, because this is influenced by multiple factors, like the protein percentage, like the energy densities. You have to divide the calories by the weight of the food you eat, and then the fiber per 1,000 calories, for example, or some calculation of this sort of addictive nature of or hyperpalatable nature of foods. This becomes extremely complex if you're supposed to do this in your head or on a spreadsheet. But it's actually possible today with new AI technology to build an app that just takes all the difficult stuff. Just you don't have to think about it. The app thinks about it. And you can just take a picture of what you eat and get suggestions for how to improve, for example.
So I would love to quickly touch on the three elements as I see them. First being, what are the 4 factors underlying the satiety per calorie score that you give foods? And you already touched on those briefly, but maybe we can just go into these a little bit more. The second is the AI that's used to interpret the images that people take of the food. Then third, I assume also AI generated recommendations that users receive on how to improve the satiety per calorie score of their overall diet, right? So would you mind touching on those?
Yeah, that sounds great.
So the first is the 4 components of the satiety per calorie score, basically, right? So how did you decide on those? I know you've seen some of my videos about what I see as the keys to a healthy body weight. So I do talk about protein percentage as an important factor. I think you alluded to this. This is very clear. People who eat a higher percentage of their calories as protein tend to eat fewer calories. That's just by itself, right?
Yeah, it's one of the strongest factors, or one of the factors that we weigh the strongest, because there seems to be so much good evidence that it's a very, very powerful factor, at least in the long term. Maybe less so in the few hours after the meal. Other things may be more powerful, but if you look in longer term studies, at least, it seems to be among the most powerful factors.
So protein percentage, is that a linear relationship? And how should people think about this in terms of, well, if I'm writing down what I'm eating and I'm currently eating, say, 14% of my calories as protein, like, do they benefit from increasing? And
yeah, definitely.
How far do they, like, how much higher could they go and still see benefit?
So what our data suggests, and we have now data from 87,000 days of eating in our app collected from people using it, and also looking at earlier studies, it seems to be consistent, all of it, in that the higher you go in protein percentage, the fewer calories you will eat. And to complicate it a little bit, to be completely transparent and cover all the bases here, at extremely low protein percentages, you actually can get a lower food intake as well. But that's down below 10% or so. And that's not really a great long-term diet, because you tend to lose lean mass. It's not a long-term solution, but you can see these diets where, like fruitarian diets, or there are diets, historically used diets like the rice diet, Kempner rice diet, that tend to work actually, where you actually eat super low protein. So that can work. It's kind of like a dip in the beginning, and then it goes up to a peak at about 10 or 12% protein. And then after that, it's just down all the way up until very high protein percentages. And I wouldn't recommend the ultra low protein diets. They're just, they have other drawbacks. So what we're left with then is just a slow slope down. So the higher you go, the less calories you're going to eat. I would suggest a lot of people could probably do well by going to about 20% If you go to above 30%, it's even more effective. You can go to 40%, but then it starts getting a bit hard to do, perhaps. Some people may be able to tolerate that for a while. 50% also possible, but that's really challenging in the beyond the short term. And that's pretty much as far as you can go, I think.
Now, I know that many of my viewers are going to ask, you're also a doctor. So are there situations where you definitely don't want to go too high on your protein intake?
Yeah, I think the risks of that are generally extremely exaggerated, and for normal, healthy people, shouldn't really be a problem in the normal term. Like if you have severe kidney disease, you may have been given instructions to keep your protein intake low to avoid needing to go to dialysis. That's an extreme case. You know it if you have very, very severely injured kidneys and you've had advice from your doctor to eat a low protein diet, then by all means do that. But if your kidneys are anywhere close to normal, they can handle a high protein intake.
Yeah,
I'm not aware of any person with healthy kidneys or at least semi-normal kidneys to have any issues from eating a high protein diet.
So then let's move to the second factor. Maybe the way I think about it, that would be fiber content or fiber densities, how I think about it more, like
exactly.
grams of fiber, that's per 1,000 calories.
Yeah, that's exactly how we think of it as well.
And so similarly there, the data do suggest the more fiber people eat, the lower their what we call ad libitum calorie intake is. So if they just spontaneously eat without counting calories, how many calories do they eat until they feel comfortably full and stop eating, right? That's
So when we look at the literature and the scientific studies, and also when we look at the data from our users, this appears to be the weakest factor, but it's still a significant effect. It's noticeable, but it's not super powerful.
So then the next one in my line of thinking would be energy density, which is a metric that is computed as kilocalories, say, per gram or per 100 grams, right?
Exactly.
So there again, based on my research, based on your research, what we're seeing is people, if they're being fed, meals that just, are similar, but that vary by how many kilocalories they have per, say, 100 grams. The higher that number, the more calories they tend to spontaneously eat, right?
Yeah, so humans are kind of wired to eat about the same amount of food no matter what. So if the food is full of calories, we tend to eat a lot of calories. If it's fairly empty from calories, then we eat a lot less. And we compensate for this a little bit, but far from completely, which means that this is actually quite a powerful factor.
So let's wrap this part by looking at the fourth factor, and that is, do you call it hedonic or like hyperpalatability, I guess?
Yeah, we just said hedonic because it's shorter and looks nicer, but hyperpalatability is something that is often called. Mm-hmm. Another way to think of it is how addictive a food is.
And this is, so from my perspective, I said in the video when I covered this, there's been some work done to try to identify what specific nutrient combinations make a food hyperpalatable or give the food a very high hedonic value, meaning it's the kind of food where our brain, certain regions in our brain light up like a Christmas tree. We know this from fMRI studies. And, people eat one of these potato chips or one of these crackers, and they just feel it gives them some reward that keeps them going, and they just keep eating them. And so what we know is that certain combinations of sugar and fat certainly have that quality.
Yeah, like earlier. Chocolate or ice cream or something.
Mm-hmm. Certain combinations also of carbohydrates, so starchy foods with salt, like sodium, a certain percentage, like pretzels or crackers would be good examples there. And certainly also fat and sodium, right? I think is the third category, where we have things like, say, hot dogs or pizza would maybe fit into that category as well.
I think you have salted nuts, which like salt and fat mostly.
How do you see this research where it currently is? I mean, this is a fairly new field of trying to understand what makes food hyperpalatable.
Yeah, I think it's the weakest area when it comes to scientific support, but there is some support and also a lot of common sense that, hey, we all know this is true, right? We all experience it every week, maybe every day. And Yeah, I think that the scientific support is strong enough combined with some common sense that, yeah, this seems to be a powerful factor. There was also this, the new Kevin Hall study that is in process that he released some preliminary data from where they see that people eat a lot more on ultra-processed foods, but when you remove the high energy density and the hyperpalatability from them, then they become far less likely to drive overeating. So there's like a bit of an experiment there where you actually see that, yes, removing this hyperpalatability factor has an effect, making people eat less.
Yeah, so I agree with you that the scientific evidence, so just the amount of work that's been done in this area on hedonic eating or hyperpalatability of foods is weaker than, say, for energy density or for protein. But I also agree with you that it's almost certainly a very important factor. And I do anticipate that there's going to be a lot more research coming out where we potentially refine these factors more and get a better sense of what it is really about the foods.
You can put on your conspiratorial hat and think that the food industry doesn't want these studies to be made because it would be very inconvenient.
I actually think the food industry has a lot to add to this if they were willing to, open their playbooks, because I think they've known these factors for at least 20 years and have used it to great effect to make the food hyperpalatable and get us to
if
eat
they
and buy
would
more.
open up about what they know and publish it, I think that would be great, but it doesn't seem very likely.
So let's maybe briefly touch on what made you focus on these four factors. So protein, fiber, energy density, and hyperpalatability or hedonic qualities of the food. Because when you look at my videos, I identified a few other factors that I think we could argue could also have been considered, and maybe you did consider them. So one I identify, for example, is the texture of the food. So soft food, for example, seems to be eaten a lot more. We tend to eat a lot more calories if the food doesn't require a lot of chewing, whereas hard textured food. Did you give that some consideration?
Yeah, we've discussed that, and I think it makes a lot of sense, and probably it's something we may include later. I think the main thing that's holding us back there is it's difficult to do technically because nutrition data doesn't contain that information. So it probably would have been extremely hard to do up until recently. I think that with modern AI, we could probably include that. We could have AI predict the hardness of various foods. It will probably be possible. But yeah, that's the main reason. It doesn't seem like a super strong factor, perhaps, but there is some intriguing evidence that yes, this could actually increase the predictive power of our algorithm. And at some point, I'm hoping we can include it.
Yeah, that's what I thought, actually. I was wondering about this in terms of, the nutrition database obviously do not include any information about how much chewing the average person would have to do for a piece of cooked versus uncooked broccoli and so forth, right? So that's
unfortunately not.
Yeah. Other factors that I found, so speed of eating actually is one that I found. So that's more of an individual factor and less of a factor of the quality of the food, but it's strongly related to the degree to which a food requires chewing.
Yeah, same thing there. We don't have that data. I will also say that most likely this correlates pretty well with the other factors we have there. Just out of curiosity, I was doing this experiment the past 2 weeks, eating a very, very high satiety-per-calorie diet, and it takes a lot longer to eat. If the energy density is lower, you have to eat more, right? It takes longer. If you have foods that have more fiber in them, that means more chewing, and higher protein foods often also require more chewing. It takes longer. While these hyperpalatable foods, they tend to be things you can eat very quickly, and then you want more. So I think this correlates well with the ones we have, but it's possible that we could get even more predictive power by including this one too. And the problem there again is we don't have that data easily available, so we would have to create it somehow.
Yeah, that's actually what I thought. So, as I was thinking about this and preparing for this interview, I was wondering, as I reviewed the literature, I identified a few additional factors. like the softness of the food and the speed of eating, for example. But I wasn't sure they are not already, at least to a large degree, covered by the factors you have included, because also higher protein and higher fiber content, both of these, and lower energy density, both of these will slow eating down and require more chewing.
Yeah, so I'm not aware. I don't know if there is a good enough knowledge about this yet. My educated guess would be that we would get a little bit extra value if we had that data and we could include it in our algorithm. We would add a little bit more predictive power and it would be a little bit stronger. But that's my guess. We'll see. I'm hoping we can have that in the future added to our system.
I think that's actually a nice benefit of the way you do this. It's on the back end. So however, you can always factor in new science as it comes out and change your algorithm. And for the viewer, it doesn't visibly make anything more complicated. They just
I expect
scores, right?
Our algorithm is the worst it will ever be today, and we'll make it better. That said, I think it's possibly the best system in the world right now anyways.
How the Nourished by Science satiety score and the Hava SPC scores compare? I had created the video about satiety, eating to maximize satiety per calorie, before I'd ever seen the Hava app. And in it, I have a poster, a very simple poster with the satiety score of foods, where I just used kind of a simple algorithm using just a spreadsheet to kind of help people learn about how to incorporate protein and fiber and energy density to come up with an idea of whether a food is highly satiating per calorie or not.
Well, clearly you're a very smart guy. I mean, this took us a long time. So kudos to you for just putting it together quickly.
So what I will say is my satiety scores on that poster, if you were to plot them using the Hava app, there's a very strong correlation. And so that's not a coincidence, of course, even though I know nothing about your specific algorithm. And I would agree based on the 2 weeks of use that I have now put into the Hava app. I think it's a very useful tool, even for me, as I know this. Quite occasionally, I will take a photo of something and be a little bit surprised. Not hugely, but I will be a little bit like, oh, okay, well, maybe I could make that little tweak.
Yeah, me too.
It's quite nice. How does satiety per calorie affect long-term body weight? The next kind of bigger question I'm sure viewers probably have is that, so we have now an understanding of, okay, if I sit down for, say, lunch and I eat a meal that has a high SPC score, right? High satiety per calorie score. That means that at this lunch, I'll happily stop eating and feel comfortably full at maybe just 400 kilocalories. Whereas if I went to a fast food restaurant and I ate a low satiety per calorie meal, I may eat 700 or 800 kilocalories. So we know in a single meal, our calorie intake will be lower if we eat high satiety per calorie foods or meals. Do we have any knowledge on how this translates to long-term calorie intake and weight change?
We do have some knowledge. Of course, we have all these studies that the whole system is based on. But if you combine it all and go strictly by our SPC scores, like I mentioned, we have 87,000 days of eating from people in the app. And what it shows is that people eat far more calories on a low SPC score compared to a high. And the difference is like almost 2x. You see a reduction in calorie intake by almost 50% when you go from relatively low SPC foods to quite high. And so that's full days of eating. I've used it for more than a year. So I know that this seems to work pretty much long term as well. And what I did just recently is I did a 2-week experiment by myself to see what happens if I go from eating a pretty good diet, SPC 55, sort of in the middle, very, very reasonable. But what happens if I take it to the extreme? So I went to 70 plus every day in this score, which is quite high. And what happened is I ate 800 calories less every day on average. And I lost 2.4 kilograms in 2 weeks. And I mean, people may feel like, okay, well, I heard that before. And I suppose that's not so uncommon. But for me, that was pretty extreme because I felt like I already ate well. Like you could argue maybe it doesn't make much of a difference to push it even further, but actually there was another level or two, so that and the experiment was I wasn't trying to eat less, I wasn't trying to cut my calories, I was just trying to have the SPC score be high, and then I ate as much or as little as I wanted. So I tried to feel like, okay, am I hungry? I'm gonna eat something. So I had quite a few snacks. Whenever I was hungry, I had something to eat. But I still ended up eating, 1,700 calories a day or something, which is insane because I'm a pretty tall guy, and that's way, way, way below what I need. Yeah, I had to stop after 2 weeks. I'm happy I didn't sign up for longer because I would have gone down way too much.
Yeah, I think that I saw you post some of that on Twitter or X, and that was, the degree to which even someone who already eats well and who doesn't, it's not like you have a lot of weight to lose.
No.
How that still reduces your calorie intake so substantially. The effect size seems pretty.
Yeah, I was surprised myself. And I've been trying all these different kinds of diets over the years, mostly low carb and keto diets, even close to zero carb diets. Anybody's free to try this out for themselves, but at least my experience is that this is much easier than a zero carb diet by a lot, not least socially easier, and yet it seemed even more effective.
So what's your best estimate if, say, someone's currently eating, let's say, 3,600 kilocalories? I actually have a video coming out where I use this exact example. So someone eats the average American diet with 70% ultra-processed foods and lots of fast food, just lots of energy-dense foods, potato chips, ice cream, left and right. And they barely eat any whole foods or vegetables and fruits and so forth. They eat 3,600 until they're comfortably full each day. If they really took to heart what you're suggesting here, and they, let's say, eat, maybe not so extreme, but let's say they eat a satiety-per-calorie diet that has maybe an SPC score of 60. Like, how much could they expect to spontaneously and without feeling hungry or deprived throughout the day reduce their calorie intake? What's your best estimate?
Just going by our data, which is not perfect, but it's what we have from thousands and thousands of users in the app. If they went from a standard American diet that tends to be somewhere in the high 20s, and they go up to 60, I would say probably they would cut their caloric intake by like a third, give or take.
Mm-hmm.
So that would mean maybe down to 2,400 then.
And so I think one thing we both want to clarify, I actually came up with about the same number. The video is already recorded. You'll see it, actually. So my estimate was 2,400. So you'd go down from 3,600 to 2,400.
Great minds think alike. I haven't seen that one.
I'm just, in my case, I will admit it's less driven by the data that you already have. So I think one thing we want to clarify for people is that we're not claiming that you would maintain 1,000 or 1,200 kilocalorie per day deficit for the rest of your life and basically shrink until you disappear. That, of course, is not how it works. The way this would work is that as someone like that would eat fewer calories and be quite happy with that, right? They don't go to bed with a grumbling stomach. They feel comfortably full.
We recommend people to eat as much or as little as they want. And, that's what I did when I did this experiment as well. I never went to bed hungry, never.
Yeah, so they would start to lose weight. And as they're losing weight, there's certainly adaptive changes in the body, such that, for example, as we lose weight, our energy expenditure comes down. And there's another component probably that senses the degree to which our body loses fat, and that may lead to us wanting a little bit more food. So in other words, over time, that person that maybe on the first day of using the Hava app and going down to 2,400 kilocalories per day, they may want to eat a little bit more to be really happy with it, maybe to 2,600, 2,800 kilocalories, but they probably will eat substantially less than the 3,600 kilocalories they were eating on the average American diet, would be my suspicion. And so they would find a new plateau at a lower body weight, probably, right?
Yeah, a lot less. That's what our data suggests. And again, this is based on on a lot of randomized controlled trials of these various factors. So I think it's fair to say with relative certainty that it's going to be something like that.
How to make it easy to track and improve satiety per calorie of your diet. Let's maybe move into that part, the user interface and of the Hava app and what's behind it, the AI specifically. I said earlier, there's 3 elements to this as I see it. The calculation of the SPC, the algorithm. The second is the AI that interprets the photos that users take of their meals. And the third is an AI that guides the user in how to improve their SPC score, like how to make their meals more satiating per calorie. Can you talk about these 2 other aspects?
Absolutely. And this is so fantastic to be part of, because none of this was really possible, let's say 2 years ago. Generative AI and ChatGPT and so forth, it's just been an explosion of capability, right? And so there was apps doing photo tracking 2 years ago or so, but they used very technology that was just far, far worse, like earlier versions of AI. They were really nowhere close to what we have now. And the big game changer is that we can now connect this image recognition to one of these big language models, which means that it's not just about trying to see what's in the image. It's about identifying what kind of food is this and what's usually inside this kind of food. And then you have a language model which is an expert, because it's been trained on every recipe on the internet, every book that's ever been written. So it knows what's typically inside of pretty much every meal, right? And there are a lot of food images on the internet. So, I mean, it's trained on millions and millions and millions of food images, which is a game changer, because often you can't see every ingredient, but you can predict because you know what this kind of dish usually does contain. That's what's made this really, really powerful. About a year ago, it became possible. And I think we were actually the first in the world because it became sort of obvious in October of 2023 that, okay, this is coming up. And then in December, January, it became possible to build an app that's connected to a modern AI model like this. And in January, we launched it. So I think we were first, actually, which is kind of fun. And now a lot of apps have been adding a similar idea, but I think we may be the best ones. I think we're probably the fastest and nicest experience, at least as far as I know. So we've improved it a lot over this year.
Yeah, it is pretty good. So for anyone who's interested, I'd encourage you to try it out. I've used this for 2 weeks, and actually even complex meals, like say I've had a beef stew, for example, or another, like a frittata, like eggs with vegetables, lots of vegetables mixed in it. My typical morning breakfast of non-fat Greek yogurt with berries and a few nuts, like it recognizes these well. And I've actually done some measurements to try to figure out how accurate is it. It's pretty good. It's not 100%, but it probably doesn't even have to be 100%, right?
And I don't think it needs to be, but it's getting scary good for like image recognition. Of course, if you want absolutely accurate, you will have to weigh every ingredient on a gram scale. But who does that really? And when it comes to like estimating from a photo or from a visual, just seeing it, I think that the AI is on track to become superhuman. Like I would say today is probably good as like an average human who've been doing this for a little bit. But it knows more about recipes. So in some ways it's smarter. But it's really improving very fast. And my best guess is maybe later this year or next year, it's going to be superhuman, meaning when it comes to estimating ingredients and amounts from a photo, it will be better than any human alive. That's my guess.
So I do think if this even approaches what may be perfect, that is very, very good and probably better of what the average person already can do right now, would be my assessment. And I would also say if there's currently errors that are being made, it doesn't matter all that much in that, you'll get some score anyways, which is kind of arbitrary, right? The score could also be any kind of other number. So all we want to do is maybe raise the score. And
yeah,
I do think
another important thing I think is we made it quite simple to update. If you want to change an ingredient or change an amount, it's very quickly done, and it's still a huge time saver. Instead of having to start from the beginning, it's just okay. This amount I think is more, so I'm just going to increase it 2 seconds down. It's still a massive time saver.
And so let's talk about the third aspect, which is the specific recommendations given to users. And I can share maybe to start one example I had. So the other day I had my Greek yogurt with some blueberries and a handful of pecan nuts. The system gave this a score of, I think, 55 or something like that, which is pretty good. But it alerted me that if I wanted to increase the score more, I could reduce the amount of pecan nuts or just not have any pecan nuts in this dish. And I do think that's a very useful thing to know. Of course, that was clear to me because nuts are very energy dense. So that is and potentially also hyperpalatable. So in my mind, that was actually a good suggestion that the average person could concretely act upon, right?
Exactly. That's exactly what we are aiming for. Like something that's concretely useful. So people don't have to, study and read scientific studies or anything, or read like pages and pages of things to remember. No, just get to the bottom line. What can I eat that would help me? How can I tweak this? When you log a meal, you instantly get suggestions for, okay, this was great that you logged. There are some suggestions to make it even better at reaching your goals. And I think one of the reasons why nobody else has this is that it's pretty hard to give useful advice if it's just about calories. It's like ultimately you come down to like, oh, you should eat less. Okay, well, that's not very helpful. But if it's like, okay, these pecan nuts, they're actually the ones that cause you to eat, a bit more. And if you reduce them or replace them with more berries, for example, then you would most likely eat fewer calories. So it's something to try. Or, switch the yogurt to something even higher, a higher protein version of it or lower fat version of it. Yeah, we have some other things coming up as well that I think you would like a lot, even for an expert like you, to get sort of top lists of the most helpful foods you eat over different time periods and the ones that are potentially holding you back. I'm really looking forward to that myself. This is coming pretty soon.
The impact of high satiety-per-calorie eating on nutrient density. I think that leads us to my next question, and that is related to, yes, you're creating an app that is focused on helping people eat fewer calories and maintain or achieve a healthy body weight. But from my perspective, at least, as people implement this, it's very likely that other aspects of their diet also concurrently improve, simply because if you do eat more fiber, for example, if you eat more protein, the typical foods that are high in protein or fiber and that have a low energy density on top, so those that have really a high SPC score, are those that also tend to be very nutrient dense, right? On average, at least.
Yeah, nutrients often follow the protein, at least in unprocessed foods. That usually is the case.
Protein or fiber is my view, right? Where you have some nutrients that are more in fruits and vegetables and others that are very high in protein-rich foods. And so I think that having both of these factors in there would make it likely for people to also improve other aspects of the quality of the diet. So I personally like that, actually, because it's almost a positive side effect of eating for satiety.
Yeah, totally agree. Yeah, not much to say about that.
Addressing the root causes of chronic disease. So then you said earlier that when we just think generally about what's the most important consideration for choosing the types of foods we eat, of course, the foods we like and are happy with in the long term, that's a big consideration. But aside from this, I think most experts would clearly say, yes, we must meet our nutrient needs. And so, of course, eating more nutrient dense foods helps with this. But then the other big factor is to eat in a way that prevents us from accumulating excess body fat, and specifically excess fat in our visceral and ectopic depots. Viewers of my channel know about this because I mention it almost every video, because these are very strongly linked to almost any, disease, specifically cardiometabolic diseases.
Exactly.
So if you mentioned this earlier briefly, where you said, we currently have an environment where the food industry is running wild. There's basically no regulation in terms of what types of foods they can produce and then how they can market that food. And as a result, the consumption of ultra-processed foods specifically has increased to 60-70% in many industrialized countries. And what we see in kind of ecological data is that increases in obesity and type 2 diabetes follow this fairly predictably, right?
It seems like today it's like a no-brainer. This is a slam dunk. This is, I think we have the evidence that we need now. It's like a clear causation.
And so what is interesting is we live kind of in an age where, we have one problem that is almost created by technology, right? We could say this, and I'm not averse to technological progress at all. But I do think in this case, we've gone wrong in terms of the massive industrialization of the food production and agricultural system, simply because it has led to a food environment that doesn't have anything to do with the normal food environments that humans evolved under. And we have clear evidence that is making us sick. It's making us overweight and obese, and it's making us sick.
Yeah, and it's not a small problem, as you know. Maybe the listeners, not every listener might know this, but in the US, adult people in the US, 93% of people have poor metabolic health, which is caused by this food environment, most likely. And if you go to people who are 50 years or older, it's 97%. So that as you get older, almost everybody falls victim to this, being poisoned by the food supply, I think. And so it's not a small problem. It affects almost everybody. And this drives all our top chronic diseases, heart disease, cancer, dementia, stroke, and on down the list. So this is the big health problem of the modern world, I would say.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. And so where I wanted to get is that, we have a problem that at least is partly related to our industrialized agricultural and food system. And the response of our society is to find technical solutions to it. As you've mentioned earlier, we first, maybe starting about 20 years or so ago, we started doing bariatric surgeries on people who had obesity or morbid obesity. And then now we're having increasingly effective weight loss drugs of the class of those that affect the GLP-1 pathway. And of course, I think you and I were both interested in helping people be healthy. So I think we're not opposed to those solutions, right? If someone has morbid obesity and they can effectively, say, have bariatric surgery or use one of those new medications, from my perspective, that is better than having, say, uncontrolled diabetes for decades and, being unable to do something
100%.
about it. Right.
I'm very positive to these drugs, actually, these GLP-1 drugs. And I get criticized for that online because people say, oh, these drugs are risky. They can have these side effects. And that's true. But the risks, as you alluded to, the risks of obesity seem to be orders of magnitude bigger.
How to think about diet versus weight loss drugs.
These drugs are actually the first. We had a lot of drugs over the years that for weight loss that were not very impressive, right? And then just a few years ago, 2017, the first new generation GLP-1 drug was approved, semaglutide, and it's very effective. And newer drugs can be even more effective with people losing 20% of their body weight or more. So what are these drugs? Well, they're actually satiety hormones. So this GLP-1 affects the brain, makes you feel full, makes you feel less interested in eating. It increases satiety. In a way, it has an infinite satiety-per-calorie score because you get lots of satiety for 0 calories, right? So I would say that this is really, in a way, the same kind of effect we're going for here with food. It's like a natural food-based version of these obesity drugs. And some people may argue that, well, they're not as effective. Food can never be as effective as these satiety drugs. And I would say maybe it can, because our data actually suggests it may be. These drugs cause people to lose 15%, 20%, maybe 24% or something of their body weight by making them eat, way, way, way less. Well, that's what we see in our data with this approach as well. If you go from, let's say, a standard American diet of high 20s in the satiety score to, let's say, 70, well, probably you're dropping your caloric intake statistically in our data by at least 40% or so. I think that's probably going to have a similar effect as one of these drugs. Now, I'm not saying you can't do both or you can't pick the drug instead. I would just suggest everybody at least be informed and consider how about trying to eat better in an effective way, a way that is as simple as possible to do, as consistent as possible with your preferences. Like you shouldn't have to completely switch to another kind of diet, but like make small tweaks to your diet. If you could do that, then I think that's a great start. And then if you also need one of these drugs, well, maybe that's a good idea. But in that case, I think ideally it should be like a combination. Because if you could do both, then you would almost certainly get the strongest effect of all.
Yeah, and we certainly need to consider that whatever intervention we choose will only benefit from it in the long term if we stick to it in the long term. So that means if we are going on a GLP-1 drug, we know we only benefit from it if we continue taking it, right? So if we stop taking it at some point, usually the expectation would be that we regain some or most of the weight, if not all of the weight that we've lost. So I think we need to consider these options in that light, right? Where on the one hand, we have a drug that if we are realistic, we know we need to take basically for life if we want to reduce our body weight and keep it reduced. And they do have side effects, right? That's not to say we shouldn't consider them, but any drug has side effects. And at the same time, we have a way of eating that, if we find a way of eating that has a high satiety per calorie, that helps us eat in a way that we're full with fewer calories long term, and where we're happy with that way of eating, the side effects, as we've discussed in that case, are potentially additional benefits, such as having a generally higher diet quality, for example. And so I would definitely encourage everyone to, give this a try and really take a thorough look at your current diet and see whether you wouldn't be able to make changes in the direction of eating a higher satiety diet. And of course, if for whatever reason that doesn't work for you, or it doesn't work well enough for you, it isn't mutually exclusive to also talk to your doctor about potential other options, right?
Exactly. I mean, I see it exactly the same way. I would, if it was one of my person in my family, that's what I would recommend. Like, first try to see what you can do with the diet and be happy about. And if the result isn't powerful enough, then by all means consider these drugs. And the combination is probably the most powerful of all.
What do all effective diets have in common? I would like to wrap up this conversation maybe with just going through a few popular diets, because that's also number one questions I get is people are confused. Why are we losing weight when we go on a low-carb diet, and why do we lose weight when we go on a low-fat diet? Like, how does that make sense? And low-fat, high-carb diet, how does that make sense? So
yeah, it's very interesting. This is fascinating stuff.
So why don't we talk about this briefly? So let's just assume I'm your patient, okay, and I say to you, Dr. Eenfeldt, I've heard from people that a low-fat, vegan, plant-based diet actually is a good thing to do. Would that help me lose weight? What would you say?
I would say that yes, it will most likely do that for various reasons. these low-fat vegan plant-based diets tend to be low in energy density. They're very high in fiber. They're generally fairly low in hyperpalatable foods. And surprisingly, the protein level can be pretty decent, at least as a percentage of the foods eaten. Now, that depends a little bit about exactly what kind of vegan diet you eat. And I do think that most people on a plant-based diet could benefit from more protein, actually. So it's probably good to pay extra attention to the protein intake if you go plant-based. But definitely, it can work quite well for a lot of people. Yeah.
And we have clear data showing that, right? There's several
Yep.
randomized controlled trials.
There are randomized controlled trials. One called Diet Fits, which was a very, very well-made gold standard, really, study where they tried a low-carb, high-fat diet versus a low-fat, high-carb, more plant-based diet. So virtually the opposite, right? Low-carb versus high-carb. But both groups did really great. They all lost a lot of weight on average, and improved all their health markers. And the difference between the groups was all completely, non-significant. Maybe there was a slight trend for more weight loss on the low-carb group, but that was very tiny. It wasn't really statistically significant. I think the bottom line was both groups did great. And even though they did the opposite, right? So how do you explain that? Well, you sure as hell can't explain it with a low-carb model, with a carb insulin model, right? Because that would predict that only one diet would work when both did. And if you go to the other side and say, how do you explain it on a plant-based diet? Well, maybe you say there's something specifically bad about animal products, whatever. Well, that can't explain how the other side did great with a lot of animal products, right? So none of them can explain how the other guys did equally well. But if you look at it from a satiety-per-calorie perspective, now it all makes sense suddenly because, as I mentioned, the plant-based diet has a lot of attributes that would give more satiety-per-calorie. On the low-carb side, well, the energy density is not quite as good, the fiber is not quite as good, but the protein percentage tends to be quite a bit higher. And similarly, you exclude pretty much all ultra-processed addictive foods because they got carbs. So, yeah. It gets a strong satiety-per-calorie score also, but in a different way.
Mm-hmm. For different reasons, exactly. And so that's, in my mind, maybe the most important takeaway here for people. And that is, you can go, low-fat, high-carb, plant-based vegan, or you can go keto, very low-carb. But maybe you don't even have to consider just these two options. Maybe what we should try to optimize for is, how satiating the food is based on cumulatively these factors, which is why I suggest reduce your ultra-processed foods. That will automatically make your diet be less hyperpalatable, right? Reduce the number of liquid calories you consume, like sugar-sweetened beverages and alcohol. Increase your protein percentage. That's a big part of the satiety-per-calorie score. Increase the amount of fiber you eat. Reduce your energy density by being careful with added, very energy-dense foods like oils and added fats and starches and added sugars and syrups. And if you mostly eat whole foods, like say an apple or a banana or a steak actually, if it's fairly fatty, it has a higher energy density. But most normal whole foods have a fairly low energy density. It doesn't touch that of highly processed foods that are mostly assembled from fat and starch and sugar, right? And so,
yeah, I mean, I would agree with all of that, except if I may just add, at least in our scoring system, a steak generally scores quite well. Even a ribeye or something like that, which is on the higher fat side, still scores high, like 60 or something, because the protein percent is so very, very high. I think that's consistent with people experience as well, because you have all these carnivores that eat all meat diets and generally they lose weight.
How to learn more about the Hava app and Dr. Andreas Eenfeldt's work. Maybe share with our viewers how they can find you or how they can learn more about your work.
Yeah, I mean, if they want to hear me rant on about this stuff endlessly, they can go on X, Dr. E. I spend a lot of time there. It's fun. Then, of course, they can go to our website if they want. It's called hava.co, so low-carb.co, or they can just download the Hava app from the app stores.
Yeah, thanks so much, Andreas. I think this was a very interesting conversation, so thank you very much for coming on.
Yeah, great fun to talk to you.
That was my conversation with Dr. Andreas Eenfeldt. I hope this was helpful. If you enjoyed this conversation, please leave me a thumbs up and share this video with anyone you think may be interested in this content. Lastly, I would like to thank the patrons of this channel who make this free content possible. As you may know, I am keeping this content free of conflicts of interest, which means I'm not engaged in sponsorship deals or affiliate marketing of any kind. With regard to the Hava app we discussed in this video, even though I really like it and think this is a great approach to eating to satiety, very similar actually to what I have shared in my playlist Keys to a Healthy Body Weight, I'm not in any way affiliated with Andreas or Hava. If you value high-quality, evidence-based and unbiased content such as this, please consider becoming a patron of the channel. I have left a link in the description box below. Thank you and take care.